Yeah. Okay, there you go. All right, so yeah, for the record, I was up most of the night, so I didn't get much sleep. So I've made Barry host. And rather than just sitting idly, seeing if anybody else comes, I thought I'd bring up this one comment that Barry had made that might be one of the disagreements that Barry and I have. So anyway, I'm just giving context here, Barry. It was a comment that I think you made on one of my anti-religion posts. And if I may paraphrase until you elaborate further, I believe that you believe that my position against religion is pediatric, and so not reflective of the education you think I have. So I think that's the starting point, yes?
Yeah, that's close enough to set the stage.
Okay, so I'm actually glad you stated that way, because here's my position on this, okay? I do understand your point about the foundations of religion and theology and its higher purpose towards theomacy, okay? And let's see, I'm not sure I spoke that correctly, but anyway, the mathematics of God rather than the word of God. So I do understand that. Although, let me clarify what I think I mean and see if that actually addresses your point. So I have no issue that religion originated because people wanted to understand the movements of the universe and the creationism and cosmology, et cetera, et cetera. But I do believe that as it went along, more and more evidence gave rise to a more, let's say, observant method of understanding the universe, where you didn't have to tell stories about mythical gods or made up gods or whatever. You could actually more understand things in terms of evidence-based, model-based reasoning. So I would prefer, personally, that people who are really trying to understand the universe sort of, recognize that those were the origins of religion, give a nod towards that, don't ignore it. It was very valuable as part of the evolution of the system of thought that we now call science and critical thinking. But when we're now at, let's say, the modern age, where we're able to understand what we can do with the scientific method, I think that we would be better served if we spent more time in the scientific method and less time in the historical roots of it. So I'm not arguing the historical roots. I'm just saying, why constantly have the constant mention of the historical roots? I don't understand that. Why, in mathematics, you don't always have to constantly go back and say, oh, here's the axiom we started from, or here is arithmetic, or here is set theory, right? We can actually operate at the level of the issue that we're trying to deal with. So that's more my point. My point is, okay, I have 2 points. That's point number one. The second point is that the reason I really want to go after this constant noise that religious aficionados and people who exhibit religiosity espouse is they don't seem to value where we've come after thousands of years. They don't seem to value where we have arrived with the accomplishments and the insights we get from the scientific method. They would much rather be comfortable, it appears to me, okay, personally, to still cling to those very early stories of religion, of which now there are much better explanations for whatever they were trying to describe. There are many, many better explanations for that now. So the people who want to cling to religion, either its structure or its practices or whatever, appear to want to do so in an anti-scientific method. Okay, I'm not saying this generally of you. I'm saying this generally of most people who espouse religion. And that is what I'm trying to address head on. I don't want religious thinking to be more influential than scientific thinking, I think is probably the most concise way I can put it. Because the religious thinking leads to, acceptance of statements without evidence, and it leads to a practice of non-critical thinking and the people who embrace that kind of thinking. It leads to dogma, it leads to cultism, it leads to power grabs, and it leads to belief by culture rather than belief by evidence and belief by reasoning. And those are all dangerous for humanity. Over.
Okay. So I think the parts that we agree on is the importance and the value of a kind of thinking, which very few of us have ever learned, and it's called model-based reasoning. And so elevating model-based reasoning to a high level of appreciation in the spectrum of all methods of reasoning, reasoning by analogy, reasoning with mental models, reasoning with computer models or simulation models, or even games play the role of models. I think you and I would agree that elevating appreciation and adoption of model-based reasoning is something that you and I would agree is a high-level objective of science educators.
I would agree.
Okay, good. Now, it goes without saying that the main product of science is the construction of theoretical models. Nowadays, most of them are mathematical. Most of the powerful scientific models can only be expressed in the language of mathematics. I mean, you can try to narrate what the mathematics says, but typically that's a failure. If you try to narrate the mathematics of quantum mechanics, or if you try to narrate the mathematics of relativity, you basically don't get very far, because mathematics doesn't translate into narrative storycraft or explanations very well, and you basically get a pediatric misconception of what the math is actually saying. And so deep grokking, which is something I know that you promote, typically means grokking at an analytical level, which is to say probably a mathematical level as opposed to a narrative level. And it turns out that if you take our species, which I cynically call Homo schleppians, because we're schlepping around a lot of old baggage that we never got unpacked, that most of our species suck at mathematical or analytical reasoning. They may have heard of it, they may know people who are good at it, may appreciate people who are good at it, but when it comes to embracing it and effectuating it themselves, most people say they're going to leave it to the experts. They're going to do something that doesn't require such arcane, abstract, and deep brain power. And that's just a reality. That's just an observation. I don't think you can argue that everybody has the faculty of learning to say calculus. I know a lot of people who fall off the wagon at algebra. They can do arithmetic, they can do addition and subtraction, and maybe even some learn long division, although it's kind of pointless today to learn long division. But when you get to algebra, which is symbolic, when you get to symbolic information processing in mathematical languages, essentially starting with algebra, you lose a lot of middle school and high school students. Just lose them. Basically, they don't hack algebra. And that's sort of an indication that if you can't do algebra, and people say, well, I know I've never needed to use algebra. And maybe that's true for a lot of jobs. It also means you can't do deep reasoning probably on much of anything. So that sort of casts aside the option or the aptitude to do deep reasoning. And I lament, and probably your father does too, that so few people are any good at even middle school math, let alone getting into, say, pre-calculus or calculus or things that you would learn maybe in your senior year in high school or first year in college. Now, when it comes to faith and dogma, every system that's based on foundation principles, which you might call axioms or fundamental principles, the principles themselves are essentially dogmatic. They're adopted on faith because it can't be proven. They basically say, if I adopt this set of axioms, then I can do arithmetic and other math. And I think it's important to appreciate the foundations. For example, a good example is almost everybody learns plane geometry, Euclidean plane geometry. They'll learn, in particular, the Pythagorean theorem. I would say probably more than 95% of American students are taught the Pythagorean theorem and maybe even learn it. That is, they could actually use it if they needed to compute the sides of and the hypotenuse of the right triangle. But most people who learn the Pythagorean theorem don't appreciate that you better do it on a plane surface. If you do it on the globe of the Earth, a big enough triangle on the globe of the Earth, you can't use the Pythagorean theorem. Or that the angles add up to 180. That's not true if you draw a large enough triangle on the globe of the Earth or on any spherical surface. And that's why I think it's important to appreciate the axiomatic foundations, which in the case of Euclidean geometry says, only do this on a perfectly planar surface. And planar surface, that's already, kind of an abstract notion, because look at how many people I don't know how many millennia thought that the Earth was a flat surface, because it looks flat up to the horizon that you can see, which is probably 10 miles away. So people didn't realize that because the Earth curves, that once you get into big geometrical shapes that cover a sizable portion of the Earth sort of beyond the horizon, then all your plane geometry becomes crude approximations or terrible approximations. So again, remembering the constraints under which an idea or a theorem or a notion is valid, most people lose that. And then they want to apply an idea beyond the scope for which it's valid. So that's another reason to keep in mind, under what conditions can I use these ideas and I can rely on them. Now, once you adopt the axioms of the scientific method, that you can make observations, you can ask a peer to say, standing over there, do you get the same observation? Do we get consistent observations if we change places? If I swap positions with you, do we get the same observation? If not, something's wrong with our observation process, or something's wrong with our whole, foundation. So number one, you have this independence of reversal of identity, independence of the observer. The laws of nature that we're looking for must be such that they don't depend on where you're standing or who you are. They have to be universal. That's an axiom. And by the way, that axiom becomes important when you're doing cosmology, because we're all standing on the third rock from the sun in the distant arm of a galaxy. We're nowhere near a black hole, and we're at a 14.7 billion year date since the beginning of the universe, the cosmos that we know of, and that limits what we can observe. We cannot observe what it's like nearby a black hole. We can theorize mathematically. We can sort of imagine what it must have been like, 1 nanosecond after the Big Bang, if there was a Big Bang. But fundamentally, we can't make observations that require us to be somewhere and somewhen else than we happen to be.
So Barry, I grant that premise. I grant that actually. In fact, I posted that several weeks ago myself.
Okay, fine. So now let's go back to what happens if everybody adopts it. So I'll tell you two famous scientists who both are acclaimed for their role in the discovery of oxygen. One of them is Antoine Lavoisier.
So Barry, can we also skip that story, because I've heard that story from you many times also.
All right, so you know that Joseph Priestley clung to the phlogiston theory, which is which you might call, I mean, somebody might say that's a superstition in the sense that it's a failed hypothesis. And it fails
Failed
because
hypotheses don't necessarily become superstitions. They're just failed hypotheses. That's all.
Yeah. But a lot of people will look at a belief that was respected at one time, which was disqualified by some process of disqualification, and then gets relegated to, well, that's an old wives' tale, it's a superstition, it's a discarded hypothesis. And people will, because people speak in language, as word-based languages, not mathematical languages, they will sometimes choose words that have a pejorative connotation as opposed to a respectful connotation. Now, does Priestley get credit for having a theory at all that potentially could have explained combustion, just happened to be wrong?
I would say yes.
Yeah, so you don't want to say, we pretend that, we don't pretend that Joseph Priestley didn't exist, or that he doesn't get credit for participating in the discovery of oxygen. He just happened to be working on one of the models that didn't survive, fell by the wayside.
Agreed.
And we find this throughout the history of science. So we give Newton a lot of credit for the laws of gravitational mechanics, except that his model of gravitational mechanics, where timekeeping is uniform everywhere and every when, okay, and that the space-time is a rectangular grid that is solid grid, that survived until Einstein overthrew it. Einstein says, Newton's wrong about time. Timekeeping is local and is a function of the motion of the clock and the gravitational field strength where the clock resides.
Right, but this is what we mean when we say we stand on the shoulders of giants, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Now, if you say, okay, I don't dismiss Newton because his first model turns out to be missing some subtleties that Einstein figured out later on, because we appreciate model-based reasoning even when the first models are kindergarten level models.
Regardless, if they were better than the previous model, that's progress.
Well, for example, people said, well, you know, an apple falls off the tree. Okay, I noticed that. End of story. Now, I think before Newton, if I'm not mistaken, there was the daughter of maybe a baron or something, who actually did the same thing Galileo did, but maybe before Galileo did. I don't know, Galileo made a ramp, a linear ramp, and he let a ball roll down the ramp. And I'm not sure how Galileo kept time. I don't know if he had a real clock or he just used his pulse, but he would see after 1 second, where was the ball on the ramp? Then after 2 seconds, where was it? And he found the mathematical formula for linear acceleration, where acceleration is constant. And that's true if you either drop it straight, free fall, or you put it on a straight ramp. But if you put it on an undulating ramp, then Galileo goes, I have no idea how to do the math. Galileo could not do the math if you put a ball on an undulating ramp, only on a straight ramp, where the acceleration due to gravity happens to be constant. Then he could do the math because he didn't have the calculus. So if you look at the history of science, the highlights of the history of science is how you got past the limitations of the era. And so we give Newton a lot of credit because he invented a branch of mathematics that Galileo didn't have. Galileo couldn't do the case where the acceleration varies over the course of the journey. He could only do it where the acceleration was constant. And that's only true if you're, you know, relatively close to the surface of the Earth. If you go way, way high up, you know, and have dropped something from the stratosphere, now you don't even have constant gravitational attraction because you're far enough away that the gravitational field is now diminishing at the square of the distance. So you really want people to appreciate simplifying assumptions that either naively or knowingly you can get away with and not end up deluding yourself.
That's where teachers and advisors are useful.
Yeah, because very often a person will try to use a simplified model, but they'll use it beyond the range of which, say, the linear approximation is good. So you have these simplifying approximations, which let you do the math. And if you go into the next level of detail, now you can't do the math anymore. And so you don't really have even though you may have the notion of a theory, you don't have the faculty of exercising the theory, or maybe you don't have instruments that are sensitive enough to detect the difference. Now, as a systems thinker, that is to say, someone who, as a grammar school student, found out when they did these multiphasic exams that some of the exam questions had to do with reasoning by analogy. They would show you 2 or 3 cases, and you had to use some kind of analogical reasoning to answer them. And I found out that I was very good at reasoning by analogy, even though I was never taught it. They give you these whatever they're called, these IQ tests, whatever the hell they were. And I learned that I was good at reasoning by analogy, even though that was never a subject that was taught in grammar school. I'm not sure if it's a subject that's contained in any specific course anywhere. But reasoning by analogy is the beginning of model-based reasoning, because you're using some kind of a visual mental model. Now, if you're not into math and you want to do something that's like reasoning by analogy, you might use similes. Simile is a structure in English where you say, this is like that. And the word like, or as, simply says that these two things, which seem to be unrelated, have something in common in their dynamics, something common in their behavior, something common in their appearance, and that's suggests that there's an analogy, but it's only a crude, vague connection. If you can reason about this one, you can probably apply the same reasoning to that one, up to a point. Okay. So similes are sort of the first example of something that's shy of reasoning by analogy. Then there's metaphors, and metaphors try to find deeper connections, but they're more poetic and more vague. And when it comes to metaphors, if you read a lot of poetry or a lot of literature, you might find a lot of metaphors. And they're not bad. They help you understand something in terms of something you already know. Something that's familiar from just living on this planet. You are aware of something, and then a metaphor says this other thing, which seems to be completely unrelated, has something in common with it. So metaphors and similes and analogies are the precursors to analytical reasoning, which eventually becomes mathematical. Not necessarily, but more often than not.
Can I add a small point to that?
Sure.
It's at the stage where you can actually do the beginnings of abstraction.
Yes.
If you can actually come up with something called a symbol.
Yes.
Where that symbol now applies not to just one instance, but to a class of instances.
And literature, especially narrative literature, non-academic literature, is full of metaphors. And when I used to look at classical literature, I had no idea how to interpret the metaphors, because I tended to read them literally, and I go, that doesn't make any sense. Because you need a teacher who says, okay, this term that the author is using in poetry or in some legendary novel or whatever, fable, is being used as a metaphor. Don't take it literally. Take it as a suggestion of how to reason about its behavior and apply it to this other thing. Now, somewhere, maybe if you take a course in liberal arts in college, you'll learn all about metaphors and similes and how to recognize classical metaphors back in the Greek literature or whatever. And that was missing from my education because I took engineering, and I didn't have time to study the humanities. So people who study the humanities are rich in the appreciation of metaphors or similes, and probably not in technical analogies, even though there are two different ways of reckoning the relationships without doing the actual mathematics of relationships. Now, the next thing after metaphors and similes and analogies is stories. And my favorite quote from Umberto Eco, and I'm sure you've heard me say this multiple times, wherever we cannot express a theory, we must narrate a story instead. And humans have been narrating stories since they began using spoken language and then eventually written language. So most of the oral tradition, which is typically poetry, why? Because the rhyming is how you remembered the story. You told the story in poetry, and the rhyming and the meter of the poetry was the crutch that helped you remember it without changing the story. Because the rhyming, you basically didn't have a multiple choice of words. Okay. So the notion that storycraft and poetry and the epics were what humans did before the advent of technical analysis and mathematical analysis.
Yeah, that's the foundations of oral history, yes.
Exactly. And oral history becomes written history. And then written history starts to make the use of metaphors and similes relatively standardized. So in poetry, you find the tree or the clouds or the mountains, the big physical objects that are visible to you become standard metaphors. So in computer science, we talk about trees. Why do they talk about tree structures in computer science? Because the tree was the classical metaphor for that structure. Okay. And you'll find many examples of something in the physical world being used as the symbol to represent an abstraction used as a metaphor. Now, I lament that I didn't get introduced to the use of metaphors until after I was an adult, and I had to basically sort of pick it up, by osmosis, because it wasn't in any of my curriculum. But the notion that there's a linkage between a story and a theory is a very deep and profound idea. And if you can't do a theory because either you don't have one, or the language of the theory is so arcane and symbolic and technical that the audience can't decode it, or you can't even articulate it in words, then you fall back to telling stories. And stories, I mean, how did Aesop teach morality? He had Aesop's fables, which he had animals, play out these little sketches. And so you have to appreciate that the foundation dates back all the way to stories. That's the beginning of model-based reasoning. And so if you want to say that I really want to promote model-based reasoning all the way to modern analytical mental models and mathematical models and technical models, and I want to bring the layperson on board, I'm going to have to walk the layperson starting from where they're solid. And most people are solid with stories, because that's the most popular form of representing a model. That's the oldest and most popular. So from story to metaphor to simile to analogy to analytical models. And if you don't walk them step by step, they'll see this huge gap between what they know, which are legends and fables and stories and so on. And in between, some of the breakthroughs were the half steps. So parables and allegories and some certain kinds of fables and children's fairy tales, those were the carefully devised incremental baby steps to get from generic story all the way to a story that conveys a message, that the real message is analytical, but we're never going to get there with 95% of the population. So realizing what's the power of fables, legends, allegories, parables, fairy tale, they were important stepping stones, just like phlogiston was a stepping stone. So walking people along this pathway for I don't know, 10,000 years or however far back you can go. I think the Epic of Gilgamesh might be the oldest surviving story that we have. And I've never read the Epic of Gilgamesh, but I'll tell you how come I learned about it. When I started Micromuse, the online learning community, back in the early 90s, and the brightest of the teenagers who came on board who knew how to program in C language and could do coding and object-oriented and all the stuff. When the brightest of them all, and I thought this person was like 28, 29, a grad student, he turned out to be 15 or 16, high school. I was just astonished to learn how young he was. But when he picked the very first password for the root account, he picked a variation of the word Gilgamesh with, substituting numbers and whatnot. But Gilgamesh was his chosen password for the root account. And I thought, Gilgamesh, I've heard of Gilgamesh. What the hell is Gilgamesh? Turned out it's the oldest surviving written story that predates all other surviving written stories. And even after I discovered what a Gilgamesh was, I have to confess, I never went back to read it. Joshua, you just turn your camera on. Do you have something to say about Gilgamesh? You may actually have read it.
About what you're talking about, but I wanted to pretty much, since I think Sam made a point and then you've been rambling about making your point, which is quite extensive, and I think it's a great point. So I'm getting excited because I think you're at and model-based reason and math for something old, so on and so forth, all the points that were. I turned on my camera is because you said it's the oldest story that we know of. Stories that were not written down.
Gilgamesh is written down. Now, I don't know if there's any older stories from the oral tradition that we have. I never studied liberal arts, so I don't know this. Maybe you do.
Yeah, so I do. There's a lot of really thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of older stories.
Okay, so the one Gilgamesh comes from the Middle East, comes from the same part of the world that gave us the Judeo-Christian religions. But there's indigenous stories from other parts of the world, Native American stories in the Maui in Australia. Is that the right place? So there's lots of indigenous stories that were oral traditions, which maybe only survived because they were told for generation after generation. And so for a lot of people, that is the fundamental medium of model-based reasoning, stories. And they teach the dynamics of the world, they teach the dynamics of karma, and they teach some morality. That if you engage in some unwise behavior, you're going to get an infelicitous outcome. A lot of these stories are to teach not to do something that's deprecated because it's going to have a bad outcome. So it's a way of showing a prediction without just by telling a story in which the predicted outcome is realistic. Go ahead, Joshua.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
I wanted to see if Sam was still on the call.
Oh, well, I presume he's listening. Actually, we should stop and say, Sam, have you fallen asleep on us, or are you still there?
No, I'm following you because you actually got quite a long arc. So I'm waiting for you to connect the arc back to my question.
Okay.
As am I, so I'm going to be quiet. Go ahead.
So now we have that story is the medium of communicating what we know or what we understand or what we believe. And so part of the things that were enrobed in story was the stories of creation. This is a popular thing, is that our stories of creation were sort of foundation stories, and lots of cultures have their own idiosyncratic stories of creation. For science, it's the Big Bang is the story of creation. It's the current standard model. Most popular scientific model is the Big Bang. That's the story of creation. Okay.
There's a lot of holes in it now.
Yes, in fact, a lot of people now finding places where the Big Bang either needs to be revised, or maybe it wasn't at the beginning. It might have been the Big Bounce. Lots of other there's a whole new generation of people who are trying to either revise or maybe even overthrow the Big Bang as the creation story of our culture. The creation of the cosmos as we know it. So that was one function of story, creation story for the culture. Not only for the human culture, you had the creation stories for the physical world. You had the creation stories for the living creatures, plants and the animals. You had creation stories for our species, the human beings. And so the creation stories went all the way from the universe, or the world, to living systems, to our species, to our culture. So any one tribe also had the creation stories for the beliefs and practices of a clan or a tribe or a nationhood. So you had these nested levels of creation stories all the way down to the creation story of a family.
Right. I get the point.
Okay.
I grant the point.
Okay. Now, one of the most important things in these stories, and this is a word we talked about yesterday, what the hell is a relation? Now, your father would say, well, mathematics is the language of relations. So if you want to know what relations is, go look at how mathematics can characterize relations. Well, if you don't have mathematics, there's all kinds of relations between this thing and that thing, whether it's living thing and living thing, or a tree and the rain, or the temperature and the insects, or the husband and the wife, or the father and the child. So you have all kinds of relationships that are extant at all levels of interbeing and cross purposes between nations. Okay. And so a lot of the stories are sort of historical stories of relations that have gone awry, or they're parabolic stories. They're stories that are made up to simplify. So, for example, if you look at John James Audubon's drawings of the birds, if you go out and take a photograph of a bird in a tree, you'll get a lot of noise, a lot of stuff that doesn't matter. What John James Audubon did is he showed the bird, typically on a branch, eating some kind of food, and threw away all the stuff that's irrelevant to that story. So he greatly simplified. So if you look at John James Audubon, the reason it's popular is he threw away 95% of the data that was irrelevant to his message. Here's the way the bird looks like. Here's his action pose. Here is why the shape of the beak is relevant to the kind of food it's eating. Okay. And he basically kept and emphasized everything that he wanted to reveal, and threw away everything else it's a distraction. It's irrelevant. And we do the same thing in stories. So if you want to tell a story about relationships, you will leave aside the things that happen which are irrelevant to the message of the story. And that's how you get allegories and parables. Just throw away the stuff that's distraction. But the typical point is, if you want relationships to work, let me show you some examples of relationships that worked, and some examples where it fell apart and went haywire, and you had war or murder or bloodshed or pain and suffering. So a lot of the stories were stories about things that were going right in the culture and things that went haywire in the culture, so you could learn from them. So the stories were all about lots of things, not just the creation of the world, but the creation of successful cultural models and relationships that had a prayer of surviving. It was about practices that would lead to well-being and survival. And we still do that today. I mean, there are people who write self-help books or books on best practices in relationships, and they're doing the same thing. They give you example stories. And
So Barry,
yeah.
Can I grant your point that stories are effective and that's how most people learn? Can I grant that point?
Yeah.
Okay. So what would be the next point you would make?
So the next point is, before you can get to high-level analytical, for example, I have a high-level analytical model, mathematical model of the relationship of emotions to learning. That's my big breakthrough in my research, is a mathematical model that connects emotions to learning. Now, I think if I'm lucky, there might be 1,000 people on this planet out of 8 billion who might care to attend to that model and become familiar with it. Maybe 1,000. Most people aren't going to sit still for that level of mathematics. Go ahead, Joshua.
Oh, I'm just curious, and I'm not trying to be combative as much as I'm trying to understand your mathematical model and be one of those thousands people. But I think there's also thousands of people that have other mathematical models, and those are just stories. And have you read those stories yet of other people's mathematical model?
Yeah, the two people that really come, well, three that really come to mind. First, Daniel Goleman, who is a big proponent of emotional intelligence as a subject that needs to be taught as a subject, rather than just picking it up by osmosis. There is a writer who died recently. I think her name is Priscilla Vale. I think it's Priscilla Vale. She wrote a book in the 1990s called Emotions, the On-Off Switch for Learning. So she gave a binary model that if the emotions are on one side of the valence, then it promotes learning, and if it's on the other side of the valence, it deprecates learning, turns it off. So she had it as basically binary, on-off. And Sam likes to point out that whenever you have a thing that's on-off, you should replace it by shades of gray in between, a continuum. And essentially what I did is I built a continuum using the calculus instead of binary. So that's Priscilla Vale, Daniel Goleman, let's see, Brené Brown tells stories about relationships.
Buddha.
Sorry?
The Buddha.
The Buddha?
Buddha, yeah, Buddhist.
Oh, Buddha. Yeah. So a lot of stories, about relationships originated in what you would call the theological or religious or Greek, what's the right word here? Greek literary tradition, which are pseudo-religious. That is, they were Greek myths.
Okay, so I grant all that also, Barry.
So the point is that you can learn a lot of these ideas easily, especially if you're very young. So a lot of stories of relationships are written for a very young audience. And the parents who read these stories to their children, the Scheherazade, all these famous children's stories that you read, from very simple ones to sophisticated ones. I mean, I think Scheherazade is a pretty sophisticated one. You gain insight into the interplay of emotions and behavior, that is, whether people bond or go their separate ways, and that stories are far and away the most popular mechanism for teaching about relations.
Okay, so I grant that point also, yes.
Now, you can take people like Daniel Goleman and other people who do psychology, and they will give you the Freudian, Jungian. I mean, Jung was very, very big on stories, the Jungian archetypal stories. Okay, so these people were sort of bridging the gap between entertaining stories and college level analytical models of the same idea at a deep and technical level and scientific testable level. Jung and Freud and Genet and I don't know, Piaget. I sort of sit on the shoulders of Piaget and Papert. But being able to literally connect the dots and not leave out any dots, because if you leave out a dot, somebody's going to stumble and can't jump that dot. Not everybody. Some people will take it on faith and jump the dot. But if you lay out all the dots, whether it's sufficiently closely spaced so that you literally see a straight line, a continuum, and it could be branching and rejoining. That's okay too. Then you can bring people farther along to the highest, deepest level of insight than you can if you just get a scattering of stories and a scattering of Freud or I don't know who's a modern psychologist.
Jordan Peterson fancies himself one.
Yeah, he's actually, I don't think he's actually got a degree. I'm not sure what his degree.
Gabor Mate.
Say what?
Gabor Mate. Brené
Oh,
Brown.
yeah, Gabor, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Yeah, he's a little bit more technical, although he's also into the magic mushroom story. Who's just, oh, Joshua's coming back in again? You're going out and coming back in again? Okay. So deprecating one branch of this whole human story, which is all really connected. And then, in systems theory, everything's connected to everything else. And even though one pathway may no longer be the most efficient one, the fact that it was there and helped get a better pathway later on, I think it's a disservice to the precepts of systems thinking to deprecate any of the contributions that took place over, I don't know, 50,000 years from the oral tradition to modern times, that all of these things are relevant. And I take exception to deprecating the people whose shoulders I'm standing on. Because if they hadn't done their part, I mean, look what happened to Archimedes. Archimedes had most of the calculus by himself, 1,500 years before Newton and Leibniz. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper, which ended up in a monastery because the monasteries had libraries. But it resided in one copy of one book on one shelf in one monastery, and nobody could decode it because it was written in symbols. You could see some geometric pictures and some symbols, and nobody knew what the hell it said until it was rediscovered early in the 20th century. And the guy who discovered it took it to a few experts who said, this looks like it's some advanced mathematics from.
So Barry,
yeah,
if I may, I think what you're describing is the value of history, which I also grant.
Henry Ford once famously said history is bunk. And then, even after having said that, he turned around and bought the Detroit Free Press, a newspaper. And he began rewriting history. The newspaper is the first draft of history. It's the first record of an event. And even though Henry Ford said history is bunk, he ended up depositing in all the showrooms of all the Ford Motor Company outlets literature that he was dropping in because, and it was propaganda. He actually dropped in propaganda, some of which was anti-Semitic. That's how come we know about some of it. And he was basically using the vehicle of his showrooms for the Ford to provide propaganda to enculturate the general car buying public, which in those days was sort of the wealthiest of the middle class, into his notion of what should human history include. So it's kind of ironic. So
that's a built-in understanding of history, though. It's written by people who get to write history.
Yeah. One of the things that Henry Ford included in the literature that he was dispensing was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I don't know if that means anything to you. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was an anti-Semitic diatribe. And today, people deprecate the practice of spreading this anti-Semitic propaganda, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And for the same reason that I lament what Henry Ford, Henry Ford did a wonderful thing with inventing mass production of automobiles. I give him a lot of credit for that. But I look askance on his corruption of the literature that he was also passing along with the new car manuals. So I look to an honest presentation of the history of culture, and not the bogus ones where I say, I'm going to highlight this piece of history and I'm going to deprecate that piece, even though both pieces were equally valid at their time. They were
Okay, so Barry, if I may.
Can I just finish the sentence? They
Okay.
represented the best thinking of the people of their time, even though their thinking was incomplete or flawed. It was the best thinking of the people of their time. And because it wasn't perfect thinking, other people came along and said, I'm going to do a better job. But you can't do a better job if you haven't got something to as a reference.
Agreed. So I've seen nothing to disagree with so far in your elaboration of history and religious thought.
Right.
So the point that I wanted to agree with and emphasize a bit more is that we have that throughout all of history. In fact, today, you could say you marvel at what Musk was able to do with Tesla, if indeed he did anything himself. But you can also be, rocking your head to the side, by looking at what he's doing with Twitter, for example.
Yeah.
Or, getting into a cage match with Zuckerberg, for example.
You can be brilliant, right, in a field where you have a lot of depth, and you can be idiotic. A good example is Shockley. Shockley gets credit for being one of three people who were present at the invention of the transistor. Shockley was the supervisor. The real work was done by Bratton and
he gets the credit. He got the credit.
Because he was their supervisor, he gets the credit. And more people know about Shockley than Bratton and Bardeen. Is that the right name? Because Shockley left Bell Labs. He went back to his home in Palo Alto and founded the Shockley Transistor Company. But guess what? He sucked at management. He was only a supervisor at Bell Labs. He only had just a small team working for him. He didn't run a big company. He wasn't the director, executive director.
Therefore, we got Fairchild Semiconductor.
Yeah. So what happened? Was that he brought in people who knew what the hell they were doing, people like the founder of Intel and the others. But he alienated them because he was sucked at managing a corporate organization. So Shockley gets thumbs up for some things and thumbs down for several other stupid things he did, which were outside his field of expertise.
So can we then say, this is true of all history? So as I have gone on record myself, I don't actually deprecate or even criticize those aspects of religious culture which attempts to make better people out of not so good people. I will welcome that. But where they are now taking that to an extreme and trying to use their particular religious thought to impose practices and laws on others, that's where I feel there must be a line drawn. And then the second point to that is, even if it does make people, quote unquote, better people, as in practicing kindness or, charity or health or care for the poor or whatever, okay? Even so, we have even better foundations now than religion to base those practices on. Now, if people want to base their practices on old thinking and still be kind to people, that's fine, okay? But, really for people who really, really understand the way the world works, there are better ways to ground that behavior, ground those practices than religion. And that is my point. Over.
If you want to pick something to shit on, before I would shit on religion, I would shit on things that came before religion. That's even worse than religion. And that still dominates to this very day. What was the mistake that humans made 6,000 years ago that was the worst fucking mistake humans ever made and remains the dominant culture to this day? Even though they don't call it a religion, it's a set of beliefs and derivative practices that are taken on faith.
I know the point you're making. Okay, I know the point you're making. But yes, we can extend the conversation to that also. But it is the case that for now, the rule of law, as you like to point out, is unfortunately what most nations are based on. Okay. And I agree, there are ways to improve that. But I do think that there are, at least up until the last decade, there's been indications that, that is somewhat workable, although non-optimal and many times not workable. But in religion, it is quite evident that attempts by religions to impose their practices on others typically lead to other religions not really welcoming that. And then, violence ensues, and then deaths ensues, and then violence, propagates. So, yeah, that is done by the rule of law as well, but it is also historically done by these religions who want to dominate. And the big, Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religions very much exhibit that behavior. And that is what I feel must be curbed.
Which is more violent, governments or churches? Which is more violent?
Governments and churches used to be very, very much arm in arm.
Yeah.
Up until, let's say, the French Revolution or the United States. But they used to be very much arm in arm. So you can't really separate them for most of human history.
Today, in the 21st century, and even in the 20th century, which is more violent, governments or churches?
Right now, just by counting the number of deaths, I don't know, because they're both responsible for many deaths.
Joshua, do you know?
At this moment in time, what's more violent?
Government is of all the world's violence, of all the bloodshed and loss of life, which is more violent? Government-sponsored violence or church-sponsored violence?
But look at the control of the governments behind the scenes, though, Barry. You could find a lot of churches behind those governments. In fact, look at the Republicans. They claim, for example, this is a Christian country, okay? Look at what they're even saying. Look at the Middle Eastern countries, most of which are, basically drawn, there's boundaries are drawn by cultural differences, often based on religions. So that's why they're arm in arm, Barry, right? If you want to look at history.
What church is behind Russia? What church is behind China?
Good point. That's a more complex story. So I think your point is that governments are more responsible for at least, numbers of deaths if you're counting violence this way.
In the 20th century,
but look at all of history, Barry. Look at all of history.
Well, first of all, you didn't have secular governments until would you say the French Revolution was the beginning of secular governments? Because the monarchy was divine right of kings, and so the power of the king came from God because it was called the divine right.
In Western history, that might be the case. In Eastern history, it's a more complicated history there as well.
Eastern theologies tended not to have deities. They had the apotheosis of the highest value, but the apotheosis of the highest value was not represented by a deific storybook character. It was just an abstraction. So you had the way, the Tao, just an abstraction. You had the process of enlightenment in Buddhism, just an abstraction. Now you could take the process of enlightenment or the way, and you could assign to them a superhero deity, superhuman deity, which is the practice in the Western culture. Because if you want to tell a story in the Western culture, you had to assign a storybook character to represent the abstraction. Otherwise, you just lost your audience. Somehow or other in the East, they managed to be able to represent abstractions without necessarily assigning them to a anthropomorphic storybook superhero.
Yeah, but look at the cultural difference, right? The tendency towards a very religiosistic view that there must be a deity is very Western.
Yes.
In fact, if you read the Tao Te Ching, at least in the translations, there's an entity called the sage or the wise one, right? But you don't have to call them God. You don't have to ascribe to them superhuman powers. You know, they're just people who are more woke
You can't tell
than
people
others.
2,000 or 3,000 years ago what they have to do. They did it. People 3,000 years ago did what they did. You can't say that people in the past can't do what they did. That's unscientific. They did what they did. They used the medium of their time and the medium that worked for them in that culture. They did.
So I don't understand that point.
Well, because I mean, why does I'm going to say somebody's name you don't know? Why do people go to the superhero movies, the Batman movies and the Spider-Man movies? Why do people go to these Why is there this huge market for superhero movies? You've got Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. Why do they have these human superhero characters in these superhero? Why is that what brings people to the friggin' movies? Why can't they just do an abstraction?
So I don't understand that point
We
either.
both have our.
Yeah.
Say what, Joshua?
Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I see on my thing. I raised. The hand was up, and then Sam put his hand up.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah, I can. Unfortunately, the color of your hand up against that awning is really hard.
No problem. I actually raised my hand. My hand was here.
Oh, sorry.
Then it's okay. I'm saying we both have our hands up.
No, go ahead. You were first.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. From my understanding of my logic and my model-based reasoning is that throughout history, there were wise sages, there were groups of people that did amazing science. How they came to those conclusions is not always documented so clearly, because a lot of it is folklore and hearsay and stories. But they did come up with things that still persist today, such as the Vedanta teachings, the Upanishads. And in those stories, there's actual science of health-related records of how to mix certain herbs together, what properties different plants have, that still persists to this day, that when you study it through modern science, it holds up to be true. So my theory is that throughout all of human existence, there are groups of people that collect knowledge, share the knowledge, and then get persecuted for that knowledge. The knowledge gets destroyed. It might be written down in whether it's knots on strings, whether it's carvings on stone walls, who knows? You know, there's a lot of different ways to document knowledge throughout time, but the people that come later always challenge that and destroy it. And this constant cycle of craziness, some people call it religious ideology or whatever. And what I'm hearing Sam saying in the beginning of this conversation is we need to come up with a better way so that these things that are known to be true, are called false, turn into dogmas, turn into religion, turn into all these things, aren't progressing humanity's knowledge forward. And how we I think the question that I have to ask in this conversation is, how do we progress knowledge forward in a way that we don't dismiss older things and we actually are on a trajectory of creating better for an understanding or a story that is helpful. I don't even know, the word better is so subjective, it's hard to use that word, but how do we keep the knowledge from the past, especially like Gilgamesh is the ancient flood story, the pre-Diluvian flood. It's pretty clear right now with modern day science that actually happened. We did have a flood period 12,000 years ago, but were there cultures and civilizations that had more knowledge than we have now of the reality of how far we can look outward and inward, and how the mechanics of that and how we can model that the reasoning and how we can utilize the very energies that are properties that we, right now, from what I understand, there's 4 basic energies that we understand, but there's probably a lot more than that. And we don't know, Nikola Tesla, who's Elon Musk named his company after for the cars, his understanding of science, I feel, is not built upon in a way that actually progressed forward. A lot of his information was in folklore. They say the United States government came in and took a lot of his research and work when he died and buried it away. And he had a lot more patents than were published. So how do we continue to move forward instead of arguing about what we know in the past? What do we actually know right now? What is clear, and what are the questions that, like, those 20 physicists that wrote down the 20 things they didn't know about quantum physics in the 1920s? When are we going to do that again? Like, when are we going to say, okay, string theory does not make sense? The Big Bang is getting proven wrong with our new James Webb telescope looking at, a better view, a better observation device. Where should we progress moving forward? And if I'm hearing you right, Sam, I'm going to ask you a question. If we stop talking about the religious ideologies, that will help the progression moving forward? Or where are you coming from? I just want to hear your understanding. I'm complete for now.
Barry, may I respond to Josh's question?
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so thanks for asking the question. I am actually in the practice of applying the scientific method to the points that have been raised here, which is the models that work, we should evolve them and elaborate them, improve them. The models that don't work, we should deprecate, not eliminate completely. We basically assign them their role in history, but we need to move on from them. And so that's how I view old religious thinking, just like I view phlogiston, just like I view, Immanuel Kant's, racist philosophies, just like I view, stuff that we have better explanations for today. And that's why I say systems that hang on to those old explanations, those old stories, very strongly appear to do so primarily for control and power and influence purposes. They're not doing it for truth. They're not doing it even necessarily for the betterment of society. They're doing it for the accumulation of an exercise of power and influence. And that is what I consider dangerous to society and civilization survival. And that's why I want to deal with it head on. I'm not devaluing their role in history. In fact, we need to know their role in history. We need to know about Hitler. We need to know about the Mongols. We need to know about all the atrocities. But we need to deprecate them in the current thinking. And we need to work on models that work, and we need to improve or eliminate the models that don't work. And that is my primary thing. And also minimize the damage that bad thinking causes. Over.
I agree with you completely. And I just think where I see the differences between you, Sam, and Barry is Barry's background in Judaic philosophies and Judaic belief systems, where what you just said to me is the basis of Judaism, which it's a very complicated thing because it's a practice of a people, and it's also called a religion. So being Jewish, you're religiously Jewish, and then you're genetically Jewish. And it's a very, I mean, you can espouse a lot more, Barry. You're
culturally Jewish. A lot of Judaism is cultural Judaism as opposed to theological Judaism. Most culturally defined Jews are not theologically adept at explaining the underlying abstract theology of Judaism.
Yeah, I say the little that I've understood, there's some knowledge that is kept not so much secret and hidden, but it's still not common day, meaning Kabbalist mathematics. there's a practice in Judaism, and I still to this day don't understand exactly what they're doing, but they take a little device, they put it on your arm, and they strap it. Do you know what this is called, Barry?
I have one. I can go bring it out of my drawer downstairs. It's called a tefillin. I'll tell you exactly, if you want to know exactly where it comes from, there is a very abstract teaching in Judaism. It's basically one or two sentences. And I'd have to look up the exact wording because I don't think I could recall it from memory. But there's a passage which gives you the most abstract guidance, that what the sage would guide you. And then after it gives you,
Sam familiar with advice? Do you know what I'm talking about, Sam?
No.
do you know what you know what a
maybe
mezuzah, you know what a mezuzah is?
No.
I do.
All right, mezuzah is a little container that has this passage on it, and you nail it to your door, and you also nail it at an angle so it slants inward, and it all comes. And the tefillin are the same passage. There's a passage that gives you what you would call a sage's guidance for how to live your life, most prudently and efficaciously. And after he gives you this, about a paragraph, it says, you shall write these words upon the doorposts of your house and upon your gates, and you shall bind them for a sign upon your arm and upon your forehead. And so what they did is they literally took these words, a little piece of paper, what these words are typically in Hebrew, and you put them in a little thing called a mezuzah, and you nail it. And I got one of the doorposts in my house that I've had for, I don't know, 40 years. And when I was bar mitzvahed, I was given a set of tefillin, and you put one on your forehead. It's a little cubical box. You strap it to your forehead, and one you wrap around your arm, and then you read this little passage aloud once or twice a day. I forget the exact ritual, but it's a ritual to remind yourself of this symbolic teaching of how to live a wholesome life. Okay, and you have these symbols, these physical devices that have the writing in it. And if you walk to the front door of my house and you look on the upper left, you'll see there's a mezuzah there. It's got those words in it. And if I open the drawer of my chest of drawers down in my bedroom, I can pull out. In fact, maybe I should go get it and show it to you. And I remember when I was age of bar mitzvah, for about a year, I did that. I put the thing on my forehead, and then I recited that passage that says, this is the prudent way to live your life. That was the teaching. Joshua.
I'm just going to share with you guys, so we've been talking for a long time, my biggest realization, like your understanding mathematical of emotions, my biggest understanding is that there were ancient practices, and this is just from my experiences, that allowed people to hack the human body in ways that we have forgotten. And my hope and my dream is that throughout time, throughout science, throughout a trajectory of humanity, we relearn the knowledge of the ancient people of how to hack the human system, meaning our understanding of the brain. I remember being in a taxi cab in Egypt, and the gentleman who was driving the cab said, we understood brain science in the 11th century in Egypt. We had people that could do science higher levels than the modern day brain scientists today. Now, is that false? Is that true? I don't know. I wouldn't proclaim to know for sure, but it leads me to say, you know what? Let me keep that as a hypothesis. Maybe that's possible. So I've spent most of my life trying to understand, are a lot of these ancient practices bullshit, metaphors, and just stories? Or do they have basis in science? Are they actual, real, and true? And the more that I learn from like Stanford professors studying microbiology in the brain and the basal ganglia, there's consciousness studies that were understood in ancient times that we have forgotten and are relearning. And a lot of it is just confusing because there's too many stories being told, such as people that have these extraterrestrial experiences, out-of-body experiences. A lot of them can be led back to actual physical implications of, at that moment in time, there was a crack in the earth, a shifting of rock that lit out kinetic energy. maybe piezoelectric energy, we don't know, something, but it changed the actual brain chemistry and had people experience things that they can only interpret through story. So they say little gray men came to them, but there's something going on in the brain that creates the conscious agency that allows us to interpret reality. And how we interpret it, a lot of it is influenced by what someone else says, but it's not real and true to what is actually going on electromagnetically of the interpretation of light and sound and reality. So my belief is that there was ancient practices that understood reality more realistically and more accurately, bearing witness, than we do today. And that's my belief. And I'm still trying to learn and figure that out from going to places like Peru, Egypt, India, and experiencing some of the ancient practices and ancient rituals. Whether you go to the Amazon, you know, I've done dimethyltryptamine, I've experienced different brain altering chemicals, but how we perceive reality, can you use what Sam was saying, applying that? And a lot of the scientists that I know, and mathematicians, computer scientists, a lot of their big breakthroughs were made with mind altering substances. So what were the ancient pharaohs of Egypt doing with different plants that were mind altering, and what states were they getting to? And that leads me back to the Star of David is, you know, two triangles on top of each other, but that represents the star tetrahedron, which in a lot of ancient practices is called a Merkaba, which is a practice of breath work and breathing to take the magnetic energies in your actual body, which we know are scientifically true. We have electric energy, and moving that energy in a way that you're altering your brain chemistry without an outside substance, and getting to states of consciousness that are quite fantastical, such as Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a famous mystic and gets dismissed out of history, but a lot of his thinking influenced people like Charles Babbage and a lot of, you know, famous mathematicians. And he would go out of his body and experience mind altering states that just seem unreplicable. But it does exist, and there are people that do that, and the science is trying to catch up to understand what are they doing in these states of consciousness. And that's my belief, is that there were ancient people that not only understood what you said earlier in the conversation, Barry, really hit me, that the mathematics of geometry only work on a flat plane, but they were doing mathematics, which is why I believe in sacred geometry. And you can take the word sacred out and just say geometry. It's earth measurement. And when you measure the earth compared to other planets, what is the temple of the sun and the temple of the moon in Mexico but a giant transistor and a giant supercomputer to interact with other devices outside of this planet that we've forgotten how to communicate to, because we're using electromagnetic signals that are so weak they can't travel fast enough, but maybe they had ways of creating signals that could travel faster. That's my hypothesis. Does that sound absolutely crazy, or does that make any sense to either of you guys?
I'd have to research it because I'm unfamiliar with the temple of the moon and the sun. I mean, you can see very large structures from outer space. And so one of the ways you can signal a great distance is build something really, really big that could, in principle, be seen at a great distance. It's not that hard to figure out the relationship. How big does something have to be seen at a great distance? That's the simple outline.
I don't know if either one of you guys have been to Egypt, but there is the Luxor temple is quite the mathematical apparition. It's the columns are huge, these obelisks, and it's laid out in a very mathematical way. And so the more I study those things, the more I say, oh wow, that is a transistor.
Remember when they figured out that Stonehenge was an observatory that was lined up to the summer solstice?
Oh yeah, remember when they found Göbekli Tepe and now they're finding all these new different things that were pre-Diluvian.
The Antikythera mechanism. There's lots of things that were discovered that were a big mystery. And then finally, some very bright person figured out the mathematics to show that Stonehenge was an observatory that gave you the seasons and where the sun was going to rise and fall different times of the year. And the Antikythera mechanism was a orrery of the planets in basically a big clockwork mechanism, a complicated clockwork mechanism. And, people have built these things, algebra and algorithm are two Arabic words that were introduced about 1,000 years ago. Arabic numerals, algorithm, and algebra were introduced. And by the way, spherical trigonometry, triangles on the surface of the globe called spherical trigonometry, you could actually sign up for a course in it, in a sufficiently advanced math department. Spherical trigonometry was introduced by the Islamic mathematicians 1,000 years ago. Around 950 AD, there was the very first book on spherical trigonometry, how to reckon triangles on the surface of the globe. That book took about 100 years to find its way to Europe. It found its way to Europe after about 100 years, and the people who were doing no ocean navigation found that book and studied it. And I don't know if it was the Dutch, I forget which nation it was. Do you remember KLM was the Royal Dutch Airline Company? And their advertising slogan is "Navigators of the world since it was flat." That was their advertising for KLM, Royal Dutch Airline. Anyhow, they had found this book on spherical trigonometry, and the navigators of the world, since it was flat, adopted the spherical trigonometry mathematics and could now navigate on the big ocean and not get lost. They were using spherical trigonometry, which they got from 100 years after the Arabs worked out the math back in the Middle East. When I went sailing in the Caribbean with a friend of mine who was the son of a Navy Rear Admiral, we wanted to practice celestial navigation. I'd heard about it. I didn't know nothing about it. But I looked up spherical trigonometry. I couldn't find any books on it. Not even at Bell Labs was there a guy who could give me the formulas for it. He knew about it, and he says, somewhere I have the formulas. He says, I don't know where they are. I spent a week of evenings deriving the formulas for spherical trigonometry to do celestial navigation. It's a bunch of signs and cosines and formulas. They fit on a 3x5 card. It took me a friggin' week to derive them from scratch. I wrote them down on a 3x5 card, and then I got a hold of a TI calculator, a scientific calculator of the 1970s, and I programmed it. And we went down to the Caribbean on a sailboat, and I had a plastic sextant that I got for like $30, and a nautical almanac that said where in the sky this year, on a certain time of day, you would see certain stars and the moon and the sun. And I had a quartz wristwatch that kept time to within a second, because 4 seconds is a mile east-west. If you're off by 4 seconds, you're off by a mile east-west. And I worked it out, and then the person with the best vision, which wasn't me, would go out and he would get the angle of elevation of a certain object in the sky, the sun, the moon, or some star, and the correct time. Then I would look in the nautical almanac and get the geographic position of where on the Earth was that going to be overhead, that object. And then I would plug the formulas into the TI calculator, and I would get our position, latitude and longitude, and under optimal conditions, we got our position within a mile of the correct position. We did typically when we were already anchored, we knew where we were. But I proved that I could do the math. A guy with the best eyesight could take the sight readings, and then I literally derived the formulas from first principles because I couldn't find them anywhere in those days, and it worked. But that was based on spherical trigonometry, which was introduced in 950 AD by some Islamic mathematicians. They work out the math. I said, oh, I didn't know there was such thing as spherical trigonometry. I get the idea. Yeah, you do a triangle on the flat plane, that's easy. Do it on a globe, that's trickier. But if you can do it on the flat plane, you can also do it on the globe.
Yep.
And like I said, a week of evenings, 3 or 4 hours a night for a solid week, and I finally got the damn equations. And you could buy this big heavy book that had the site reduction tables in it, like a 5-pound book.
With you, Barry.
I didn't want to buy the book.
I'm right there with you.
I said I should be able to do the math from the formula. I don't need a big table of book, big book of tables.
Sam's got his hand raised, just letting
right,
signal.
All right, I'll stop and give Sam a chance because I got a lot more notes here.
Oh, thank you. You're passionate about it, and what you actually did to have that. It's real. It's not fake.
And the other 3 people who went with us on that trip, I gave each of them a chance to play one or more of the roles of celestial navigation, either doing the sighting with the sextants or participating in drawing the lines on the map. It's a wonderful exercise, and when you're sailing, it's worth knowing. The average person could care less. This is before GPS, of course. Sam, you have your hand up.
I think this is all valid history, but I do feel that I don't see that we're converging, connecting the points together again, because I believe that the point that I see could be made without the detail that we just went through, which is, I'm not objecting to it. I'm just saying that it's taking a little bit longer than I expected. Because here's the main point I'm saying, okay? If we have systems of thought, whatever they are, whether they come from the Antikythera, whether they come from Peruvian history, whether they come from Mayan history, whether they come from, Atlantis, okay? If it works, we should learn from it, stand on those giants' shoulders. If we can improve them, if we can show that they're good, that's what we should do. If they are faulty, because we now know better, we should deprecate them. We should actually relegate them to the annals of history. And we should then look at what other systems of thought derive from those old, no longer justified schools of thought or practices, and question them to see whether they now have any validity. And that's the process I would like to go through with religiosity. Those pieces of religions that teach people to be kind, meditative, appreciative, let's keep those. The ones that cause people to start wars, the ones that cause people to, create caste systems, slavery, whatever. We should actually relegate those to the annals of history. That's the process I am recommending. So that's why I question every reference to religious history and the suggestion that we need to further our boundary knowledge and our boundaries of understanding, because this is akin to saying, well, if we're going to do anything with James Webb Space Telescope, let's go all the way back to, binary numbers, or let's go all the way back to, arithmetic. It's not necessary. So I don't see the constant need to go back to the roots of religion to justify where we're thinking today. And that's why I'm really questioning this constant mention of the roots of history, which I completely get. I have not disagreed with 99.99% of what you said today, Barry. I just wonder about its prominence in conversation when we're talking about things that we care about today and that we actually know the arc of history that led there. Over.
Go ahead, Joshua, I'll wait.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same path of thinking as you, Sam, in terms of my understanding of computer science and all these different languages and modeling and reasoning and understanding of ways to make calls from a server to a client or a client to a server. It is important to know where we came from, but what can we do now, and what is the most efficient way to use a computer? And I feel like we're at a cusp of computing itself is getting changed in the way that we process the bits and bytes, the ones and zeros, and the architecture of the computer is trying to process more information quickly and predict what is going to come next. And where are we going to go in computing? That's a big question that I have in terms of using this as a tool or a device to calculate large masses of information, of numbers, to model how I want to know how a humpback whale talks. I believe that these large language processing models could take in massive amounts of waves of sound and find patterns and reasoning inside of them to actually understand the language of a whale. I think, you know, it's obvious that they have a language. We know they're communicating. How do they do that? What is the math behind that? And can we use these tools to understand that?
And you probably
I
already know
think
there are
these
people
large,
doing this, right?
I do. I'm trying to find out what they're not collecting enough clear, clean data, which is what I see in all of computing right now. There's a lot of muddled data, but it's not being parsed out and normalized in ways that can go to the next level of understanding. In other words, we need better microphones in the ocean, and we need the boats to just stop running for a little bit so we can listen and have better signals. Cut the noise out. But yes, I'm aware, Sam, that people are doing this.
All right. Boy, I got a lot of notes here now. I'm not sure. I'll try to do them maybe in reverse order. Sam Chan initiated, just between him and myself, but you've seen some of it, I think, taking these abstract essays, the kind of stuff that I write for a college educated audience that I've been writing on the blogs for 15, 20 years, and submitting them to ChatGPT, which it can parse and understand. And Sam Chan actually did this at some length 2 weeks ago, asking ChatGPT, take this material, this academically written college level prose that Barry wrote on some topic, and rewrite it in a story that a third grader could understand and appreciate. And he did that for, I think 5 or 6, between him and me, I think 5 or 6 specific examples. And they all, I think 5 of them were actually blog posts dating back 15 years or so. And so whatever ChatGPT generated is a story written for a third grade audience. I would paste that story as a comment below the original blog post. So you could read the blog post that I wrote 15 years ago, and then you scroll down the comments, you say, ChatGPT has transformed this abstract essay, or whatever it was, into a third grader's version story. And then the question was, which version do you like best? And the general consensus, and by the way, this even came from my supervisor at the Museum of Science that I worked with. He says, your version is good, Barry, but I really like the third grade version better. And other people, I said, get me a third grader to actually read. I need a real third grader to read the third grade version and then say what they got out of it. Because the point is that if you take an abstract idea and you write it in a format that's digestible by a youngster, you might actually succeed in conveying the message to them at some level. Now, I went back and I said to myself, well, where else in relatively modern times have we found really good academics writing stories that transform their abstract philosophy into a story? And in Russia, you had Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and I think Pushkin, if I'm remembering the third one right. And Dostoevsky wrote, among other things, Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. And those 2 novels lampooned the hell out of the dysfunctionality of the rule of law as it was operated under the Tsarist regime. Then if you get to the 20th century, you have Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings and related kinds of material, and C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia and other things, some of which were academic and some of which were children's stories. I learned about the Chronicles of Narnia from a grad student at Harvard who wanted to re-implement the Narnia adventure in Micromuse, the children's learning community. And that's how I became familiar with Narnia. Now, this Harvard grad student happened to be Jewish, and he happened to know Hebrew. And I met him at the Science Museum. He was an interpreter at the Science Museum. And he said that notwithstanding the fact that he grew up in a Jewish culture and even could speak and read and translate Hebrew, he appreciated the fact that the Chronicles of Narnia were a retelling of the New Testament story. And if you look up the Chronicles of Narnia, it's basically you take the New Testament story,
pretty clear. Yes.
which is written for an audience 2,000 years ago, and he rewrites it for a modern audience, 20th century audience. It's the same story. He's got a lion named Aslan. Aslan the lion is Jesus or the deity or some supernatural creature. And you have basically the same story rewritten without mentioning the fact that it's a translation, a transformation of the New Testament. The Chronicles of, not the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lord of the Rings is a similar transformation of classical stories for a modern audience. And it's about power. The Lord of the Rings is about the corrupting influence of power. L. Frank Baum writes The Wizard of Oz. Norton Juster writes The Phantom Tollbooth. Lewis Carroll writes The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll's a logician. Who am I leaving out? So when I was at Stanford, and maybe probably when you were there too, Sam, if you had gone over to the humanities department, which I don't know if you ever did or not, you would have come across a professor named René Girard, and I'm sure you've heard me mention his name. René Girard was a person who did literary criticism. You do literary analysis. You looked at all the canon of written literature, all the way back to the oldest written literature, and which is basically stories, or mostly stories. And he pulled out a systems theoretic model of human sociocultural dynamics. All those stories are examples of how humans behave in a dramaturgical or storied situation. And he pulled out a systems theoretic model of how our species behaves in storied situations. And when I learned about Girard's model, two things knocked my socks off. Number one, it was a systems theoretic model that I could understand. You fit on a page. I actually wrote a one-page summary of Girard's model. The second thing that came out is that the people who told me about Girard's model, who directed me to go find it, were Christian theologians. Christian theologian says, if you take the teachings of Jesus, you take the teachings of the New Testament, and you say, from what model could you derive those teachings as best practices? It's Girard's model. And Girard's model is a model extracted from the corpus of virtually all human literature, not just the New Testament, happens to fit that one too. And the way that you could tell that this literature made sense was it had a structure, which yet another researcher, another sociologist named Victor Turner, called chiastic structure. That you had a breach of expectations and a blow up of something went haywire. And then you analyzed back down to the origin of the blow up. And then you looked at the mirror image of that, how you could have started from that big bang, that big blow up, and evolved it differently. And so a lot of stories had this chiastic structure that would, here's something that went bad, went wrong, and here's how you could have done it to change it from a tragedy to a comedy. Chiastic structure. And he points out that the stories that are really the big stories that survive, the Greek myths and the scriptures, all have this chiastic structure. They're there to analyze something that went wrong and figure out where exactly did it blow up, run it back to the vertex, and then run the story forward to a happy ending. And these are the teachings. So you have all this fabulous stuff. You have Star Wars, which is based on the Greek literature. You had all the superhero stories of the 20th century. And the most effective practitioners were the ones who rewrote all these classical stories for a modern audience. They wrote it for the comic book audience, for the movie-going audience, okay, the theater audience, and they reached a lot of people with these fictive stories that were mated to the audience. But the content, the message, was the same freaking message that the Greeks were writing, that scriptures were writing, that the creation stories were. They were sending the same message, but encoding it, transforming it, a la GPT, transforming it to a specific audience at a specific grade level, and a certain, entertainment appeal. And that's where I think I have a shortfall. And that's why ChatGPT, Sam Chan and I say, take this academic think piece from Barry and write it as if you're talking to a third grader, an 8-year-old. And the answer is more people will read it and get the message. And that's why I have to say, I appreciate the pioneering work of the story writers who are learning how to write stories to express abstract ideas that you have to have a PhD in systems theory to understand the abstraction.
So Barry, can I speak now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I agree with you, and I think that's a very strong, compelling point you're making. I would like to take it one step further. Suppose you had, in whatever representation you think is most technically accurate and precise and true, let's suppose you've got all the corpus of human knowledge in some representation like that, okay? Now, suppose that, once we have these good storytellers, either ChatGPT plus you or ChatGPT plus plus or whatever we want to call it, okay? Suppose we now, rather than ask it to tell a story, we ask it to take us on a tour. We'll go and visit a particle. We'll go visit a string. We'll go visit a molecule. We'll go visit a family. We'll go visit Abraham Lincoln. We'll go visit the Greek civilization. We'll go visit Atlantis. We'll go visit the sun. We'll go visit, Carl Jung, and let's say they do an excellent job understanding that I'm either 8 years old or I'm 15 years old or I'm 33 years old with, a learning disorder, or I'm 78 years old with, diminishing memory capacity, whatever the heck it is. It really understands me. So it knows how to craft a tour that makes exactly the points that excite me, that connect to what I already know, that base it on my experience and appeal to my learning modes, if you believe in those things, okay? So some of it is auditory, some of it is visual, some of it is tactile, some of it is just, visual, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine that it does a good job. So it's not just touring you through a museum, it's actually touring you through the universe, through whatever you ask it to explain to you. That is what I've called mentor, mentor. And it's only an abstraction in my own mind, but really GPT has come a long ways towards being able to make that real. Right. And I believe that other people will make that real within 1 to 2 years. But that's where I think, I see a value in separating knowledge and then knowledge about teaching knowledge. And that second piece is what I'm calling mentor. The first piece is really what you would call science or knowledge or, academia or history or, observing.
Textbook version of it, the abstract textbook version.
Okay, so that's what I see. And if you then say, okay, where's religion in all of that? Okay, I would see it sort of saying, okay, here's the role religion played in the derivation of knowledge. Here's the role it played in either expanding that knowledge or suppressing that knowledge. In the case of, killing people that were trying to teach the world about new ideas, yeah, religion has had a very, deleterious role in that. So let's understand history. Let's understand, where religion helps people be kinder. Let's understand where religion teaches people to, kill each other and stone young girls, for example. And let's really, figure out what is meritorious, beneficial to keep, and let's figure out how to deprecate the ones that result in consequences that we believe don't help us for our own survival and our own well-being. That is my position on religion. And that is nuanced. It's not saying all religion is bad. It's saying religion has a role in history, and we are no longer in the 16th century. We're no longer 4,000 years ago. We're no longer 10,000 years ago. We're in 21st century. Let's think like it. Over.
Yeah. What I learned from religion, and when I say I learned, I mean meta, at the meta level, meta religion, I learned about chiastic structure of stories. And I learned from Girard about the underlying abstract structure of stories, the stages that the characters go through. And I realized that these were abstract ideas that I might have learned if I had majored in the humanities and studied literary criticism, but I didn't. I studied engineering. But these ideas, which have been around, Girard had been writing books for 40 years. He was already teaching this stuff at Stanford when I was there. So this stuff was accessible to the keen research student, but you also had to spend a hell of a lot of time digesting the material. Now, I managed to, when I learned about it, I would write typically, a 1 or 2 page blog post or essay. So I wrote a blog post about Victor Turner and the chiastic structure and liminal social drama and breach of expectations. And I wrote a 1 page on Girard's model. And then in my own work, I wrote a mathematical structure of drama theory, which is essentially the mathematics of how you write a drama that has continuity. And that's an extension of the motions. So over 40 years of my life, since around 1985, I've been piecing together this whole perspective of the sources, the insights, and the repackaging, the packaging and the repackaging of these ideas to reach an audience that can, number one, understand it and embrace it and employ it. And I started at the academic level because that's where I was. Other people got past the academic level, these great authors, they got past the academic level and they wrote children's stories with the same content, same idea, but written to be an edutainment. And I very much admire, the Daniel Quinn, who did it for cultural anthropology. I can't remember all the names. There were people, Raymond Smullyan wrote some great stuff too. Douglas Hofstadter wrote great stuff. And they basically had found a way to present the material, like Hofstadter would present the material in an academic format, and then he would write a dialogue with Achilles and the tortoise, which is the same information presented as a little sketch between two comedic characters. And I very much admired their advance from theory to story to sketch, to alternate formats that would reach a different audience. And if you read both versions of it, you might end up getting it that if you only read one version of it, you wouldn't have gotten it. You had theory and example. And I think that's where most people like you and me didn't learn that in our formal education. We had to sort of pick it up in our, later years in life. And I wish I were better at it, but at least I appreciate that that's the next step. Right? Write good story. Look at Neil Gaiman. He goes to the Philadelphia School for the Arts and gives a commencement address. He says, terrible things happen in your life. You have all kinds of disasters that happen. He says, no matter what happens, make good art. And he's a master at making good art. He takes the most god-awful things that happen in life and he turns them into a series. He's got a series called Lucifer that's on Netflix, among others. Make good art. And the thing is that I buy that and I can see that he makes good art. I wish I had that talent. I appreciate it. Simply don't have the script writing skills to make it. I make schlock art. I can make a song parody, or a silly allegory or something, and it's mediocre. My poetry is doggerel, my lyrics are doggerel. But I appreciate that that's the next step, is to transform it from the academic down to whatever level the modern 21st century population is receptive to.
Can I ask a question, Barry?
Yeah.
Do you think this is a way to reach people and actually make an impact, i.e. alter their thinking? The people who currently cling to MAGA ideas, the US is a Christian country idea, the fact that, they are essentially afraid of diversity and equality because they know that they've mistreated slaves for hundreds of years. Do you think that this storytelling could impact their thinking and therefore their behavior and therefore their, let's say, their children and their children's children? Over.
I think it's only indirectly, because if you have the non-MAGA people who have their wits about them, are aware of this modality of stories. I mean, if you go back to the New Testament, it's called the Passion story, the Passion play. And who's that opera writer? The German opera writer basically writes operas that based on that stuff.
Richard Wagner, are you talking about?
Yeah, so Wagner writes operas which sort of reinstantiate this kind of material for the audience that he could reach. He could reach an audience with but that's the upscale audience. The MAGA people would never go to a Wagner opera, not in a million years. They wouldn't go to the opera at all. They might go to, I don't even know if they go to a rock concert. But here's the point. There are nominally three ways to learn something. You can learn it from a book, what's just called book learning. And most of my education is book learning. Then you can learn from simulations and games. So, and there's a huge market of games and simulations, or physical games and computer games and board games and simulations. You can learn through simulations and games where you play with the synthetic world that behaves like the real world, and you don't read the textbook. You simply learn it by engaging in a simulated world. And then there is what's called the school of hard knocks. You learn from real life. And I personally don't think that's a very smart way to do it, but there's a certain demographic that will only learn by literally personally experiencing in real life the tragedy. Not by learning it by playing a game, not learn it by reading a textbook. They'll learn it by living through the tragedy in real life. And that's what's going on in the community.
The lesson they get is unpredictable there.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, the details are unpredictable, but the arc of the story is predictable. So the fact that that Trump is now indicted by 2 or 3 jurisdictions, and that he may or may not, I mean, he's already been convicted in a civil trial, which is just monetary damages, but it also establishes the facts as adjudicated by a civil court. So the truth is coming out by the mechanism of the rule of law as inefficient and costly and time consuming as it is. At least some of the facts are now gaining the panache of believability because they went through a formal process managed by the government, as inefficient as it is. And so I expect that it's like when I was growing up, every Jewish family had on their coffee table a book that probably nobody ever actually read. It was called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It was the rise and fall of Hitler. And you couldn't go into a Jewish home, at least not in Omaha, and not see a copy of it sitting there on the coffee table. The rise and fall of Donald Trump is going to be a very similar story. And a lot of people have basically written their version. They think how it's going to play out. But in the case of the MAGA culture, they are going to have to live through the real life experience of being arrested, being tried, being convicted, going to jail, losing their job. And I lament the fact that that's, for some demographic, the only way to learn is through the School of Hard Knocks.
So Barry?
Yeah.
It is 10 o'clock for Pacific time.
Oh, yeah.
So may I wrap up where I think I understand this conversation has gone?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe that you and I do agree on most of this. Where I think we still may disagree, because I stated my position, I didn't hear you agree with it, is the role of religion history in the current conversation, this current zeitgeist, and the role of religion in either influencing society. And to me, the reason for that being identified is it's influencing in what I believe is a non-optimal way.
Yeah, it's a terrible way, but for some demographic, maybe, I don't know, 10, 20%, you tell me the number. For some demographic, it's the way that they do learn, if they learn at all.
So anyway, I am just trying to clarify my position on why I am so vehement against the extent of religious influence in current society.
Yeah.
And that's where I just want to wrap up today, because I think we did cover a lot of ground. I really enjoyed this, Barry. I really love the fact that you've addressed, points as well as you have. Josh, thanks for participating. I really appreciate this opportunity to actually explore this topic with you. I do have another conversation I need to have at this time elsewhere, but I do want to make sure that we do get to continue if there's any loose ends that you feel we still need to cover.
There are things that I would have said if I had more time. That are either directly or
you guys are free to go, keep going. Okay, I just want to,
I think
you've got the recording.
I think Joshua's got Aya, and they're out at the boat, at the beach or whatever. Not that it can't be at the beach.
Oh, we're in the front yard.
Front yard,
just in the front yard. This is our front yard.
Boat, but there's no lake there, is there?
No, this is just our driveway.
Okay.
But I appreciate the conversation too. I know Sam's got to go, and I would like to progress the conversation past this conversation so we can actually, where we got to at the end, which is let's tell better stories and let's create better and work together.
Yeah, and to tell better stories, you learn from the best storytellers who've ever lived, the pioneers and the ones who stood on the shoulders of the pioneers. They learn how to tell stories.
I agree, but instead of talking about the stories that were created, I want to create new stories together. That's what I'm trying to say.
And learn from the masters how to write good stories for your current audience.
Yep, and I think what you and Sam Chan are doing with taking your stories that are told in one way and retelling them with ChatGPT is wonderful. And I would, as a marketing guy, I advise you to put the short story at the top and let people drill down as opposed to the other way around.
Unfortunately, the only way to do it was to take the existing blog posted 15 years ago and just add it as a comment.
Okay, well, I can't turn
it upside down on Google.
One of my skills is reformatting HTML. That's one thing I know.
I mean, you could take the package and extract it off the blog and
go
put it somewhere else.
Let's go. Let's go in the car. All right, I got to take this kid to the park.
All righty.
Watch your step. See you guys later. Thanks a lot,
guys. One.
Cheers.
Stop the recording here if I can find the button. Where is it? There it is.